Welcome to Weekly Infusion with Dr. Drew Pinsky and Dr. Bruce Heischober. Weekly Infusion addresses medically related topics. It's in the know, entertaining, and everything you want to know about health and medicine. Now may I present to you the very wonderful Dr. Drew and Dr. Bruce.
Welcome to another Weekly Infusion, Bruce.
I'm looking forward to this show.
Yeah, I am too.
Personality.
This is going to be a really interesting discussion. This week's guest is Dr. Brian Little. He's an internationally acclaimed scholar and speaker in the field of personality and motivational psychology. He is pioneering research on how personal projects and so-called free traits influence the course of our lives. Dr. Little, welcome.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
So talk to me a little bit first before we get into the personal projects and all that. Talk to us about your training, how you got here. I noticed the word flourishing coming up many times in the descriptions of what you're interested in. Just tell us about your training, your practice, and how you got to this point.
Sure. I started out unsure about whether I was more excited by the humanities or the sciences, and eventually found psychology to be that perfect integration point where I could talk about neurons in the morning and narratives in the afternoon. And it worked for me. And I was originally going to go into neuropsychology. The brain in those days was a lot simpler than it is now.
Right.
And I found that I was particularly intrigued by some research going on at Berkeley, which involved enrichment of mouse environments and the impact upon glial cell development and brain weight that David Kresch and Mark Rosenzweig were engaged in. So I was all set, ready to go to Berkeley in neuropsychology. And then I went to the library one day and took down a book that was supposed to be the stereotaxic atlas of the brain, and it ended up being a misplaced copy of George Kelly's book called The Psychology of Personal Constructs. And I sat down for a few minutes to look at it because I'd heard of him. And I got up about 4 hours later and changed the whole course of my academic career. And so I decided I wanted to look at the field of personality and went down to Berkeley and managed, luckily, to change my focus down there and got swept up in Berkeley. That was 1964 to 66 in the free speech movement. And all of a sudden, the brains and the biogenic aspects of behavior that were so intriguing to me became matched by what I call the sociogenic, the cultural things that were flowing around me at the time. And I became very much involved in looking at how individuals can change the shape of their lives by engaging in personal projects which have meaning to them. I spent a couple of years as a Commonwealth scholar at Oxford University, where I was able to get away from the excitement of Berkeley, but it was a nice, gentle, intellectual atmosphere. And then eventually came back to Canada. I'm Canadian, and spent many years at Carleton University in the capital of Canada, in Ottawa. And then for the last 10 years, I've been bouncing back and forth between Harvard for 4 years and now at Cambridge University in the UK.
I'm going to take you back to that serendipitous volume that you pulled off the shelf and ask you, what was it about that? Was the contents of that, or was it perhaps your sort of experience of personality structure that intrigued you?
George was an iconoclast. He's not well known to the general public or even to the scientific community beyond personality and clinical psychologists. He anticipated the cognitive revolution by a decade. He believed strongly that we were not buffeted about by unconscious influences of a Freudian nature, or by the influences of reinforcement and behaviorism. Both psychoanalytic and behavioristic psychology were regnant at the time. They were basically the major dominant fields that one would turn to study personality. He assumed neither pitchforks nor carrots. He said he is actually a a jackass theorist. He believes in looking at what the jackass is trying to do and leave the carrots and the pricks of the fork to other disciplines. I loved his iconoclastic take. I loved the systematic mathematical way in which he adduced evidence that our lives are guided by the ways in which we anticipate events. And way before anything that came along later, he was talking about the individual as a prospective person. In fact, each of us was like a scientist, erecting hypotheses, testing them, and revising them in the light of experience. And this is pretty heady stuff. And it was aided and abetted when I got over to Oxford because the Brits were very, very Kelleyan. It actually took off much more influentially in the United Kingdom and eventually Australia than it did in the United States.
When you say it's heady stuff, where there's mathematical modeling built around that, is that what you mean?
Yeah, he describes it as mathematical theory, but it's not like typical math modeling that we would talk about it, let's say, in neuroscience. It's basically invoking mathematical structures like degrees of freedom and paths through which you might travel as deeply informative metaphors for how people construct and shape their lives.
Well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
And so hold on a second. I'm trying to process all that. I don't see the mathematical principle there. Does he predict or assess the strength of whatever with mathematical modeling?
He does, but again, this sort of predated the rise of mathematical modeling, let's say in learning theory within psychology. It was, and it's probably best explained by his method, which was called personal construct analysis through repertory grids. The term repertory is inconsequential, but rep grids elicit from individuals what their personal constructs are. And they could be looked at as dichotomous ways of looking at the world. For example, you may look at the world in terms of good, bad. You may look at other people in terms of bright, not so bright, or powerful, weak. And he developed a method whereby you could build up the structure of these within the individual case and see whether a person had a massively complex structure or a very simple one. And one of my examples that I've given in one of my books is of a student I had who had many different labels for his personal constructs, but only one mathematical construct. There was only one underlying factor to which the others were simply verbal labels, and that was in the Army, not in the Army. And that was his life. He was an ROTC student, and he had difficulties. He was let go by the Army, and his life fell apart. And part of the mathematics, if you will, or part of the deep structure of personal constructs is that you can, if you have a core construct in your life that is invalidated, just like a scientist is invalidated.
You mean much like in Army or out Army?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And he was no longer in the Army.
It's
and
almost.
So
I'm going to take you to your Western humanities heritage, maybe, and say it sounds Heideggerian in the sense that the world or even
existentialist.
Well, Heideggerian had this thing about when the world goes, the being goes with it. Right.
It's the great vulnerability, the chaos that occurs when structure is extirpated, either because structure is no longer present in your culture because of the loss of dominant ways of knowing, or in this case, at a more everyday quotidian level, you have an individual who loses structure because something that he invested so much of himself in had been invalidated. I am not in the Army, therefore, the associated structure was, I'm not good, I'm not strong, right. I'm not loved by my dad, I'm worthless.
So that's not very complex. When you talk about math and you talk about yes, no, it sounds like binary theory. Is it breaking it down to yes, like a computer does billions of yes, no, or not billions, but lots of yes, no decisions?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah, actually, in fact, the way we do what's called a non-parametric factor analysis of rep grids is that we look exactly at the way in which people allocate in a binary way the poles of the construct to different incidences, such as other people or Renaissance paintings or whatever the object of your interest is. And so it's looking at the deep structure in terms of the pattern underlying the outward and visible complexity to see if there's some deeper structure. And that example was a perfect example of about as simple a structure as you could get.
To me, I'm going to say something. It's intentionally sort of provocative, I guess, questioning. It doesn't feel like personality somehow to me. Because we think of personality as, again, let me just sort of back up what I'm saying, which is on the from my perspective, the simplistic level, they have the big five, right?
Yep.
Personality traits. And on the psychodynamic limb, which is, again, sort of what the two ends of the pole you were kind of talking about, which is more narrative / intersubjective, meaning making, that kind of stuff.
Yep.
I think about those two ends of the pole being more about personality than this. So explain it. Split the difference for me.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. And I think a lot of personality psychologists agreed with you, which was why, in a way, much of my research I felt was going independent of the personality psychology I was learning at Berkeley. Which was more along the trait line, although it was a bit more complex than that.
Explain that to people. Explain what we mean when we talk about the big five. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Probably the most influential perspective on psychology of personality right now is the big five. For your listeners unfamiliar with it, it spells out the acronym OCEAN, OCEAN, where O stands for openness to experience, in contrast to a more closed nature. C for conscientiousness, in contrast to a more informal and less conscientious stance. E for extroversion, in contrast with introversion. A for agreeableness, in contrast to disagreeable. And N for neuroticism, in contrast to stable.
I think of those traits. I don't like the big five because to me it sort of describes constitution more than personality, and I would beg a difference between the two. But go ahead, Dr. Little. Help me with that.
Well, we're in the same camp on this. I think it's a terrific way to start a conversation about a person's personality. Yeah. I'm also excited by the fact that the big five now are being shown to have neurophysiological concomitants or even precursors,
sure.
Which are fascinating. And there's where my old fascination with science comes through. I can sit down and in a morning's reading, I'm looking at the role of the insula in expressions of personality in the morning, and in the afternoon able to link it to the narrative construction that a person makes of his life when he finds himself constantly doing things that he finds surprising.
Hang on a second, because the insula to me is sort of the misery part of the brain. Is that he finds it surprising and unpleasant, or it's just surprising, period?
I think it's, oh my God, here I go again.
Right.
Part
Okay.
Of the brain.
Okay. Perfect. Yeah. Or I don't like that so much.
Yeah.
Or what's going on here more? Yeah. Yeah.
But I have been wedding the kind of insights that George Kelly provided, which are almost more assumptive than they are content saturated. For example, the approach that he takes really vests both interest and concern in what the person we're trying to explain has to say about herself. It adopted what Kelly called, rather incredulously, the credulous approach. If you want to understand what a person is on about, ask them. They might just tell you. Now, of course, a well-trained clinician is going to say not if they're an addict.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
But I was in the study of personality. And I had the choice at Berkeley of going into clinical psych or into personality. And because I was fascinated by creativity and the positive aspects of where individuals could strive to aspire, I went more into the personality field. And that is where I found that the Big Five were intriguing, but something was really, really missing. And I started to develop something that wedded the Big Five, if you wish, although I was doing this quite a few decades before the Big Five became very popular in the field of personality, with the assumptions of George Kelly that we're basically active creatures crafting our lives. Whereas he saw us crafting our lives through the constructs through which we viewed the world, like goggles. I wanted something else. I had been driving between Stanford and Berkeley, having been taught by George Kelly, and just for a very short period of time. He was visiting Stanford at the time, and realized during he had given us as an assignment as students, create a new theory of personality, which is not for the feeble-hearted, I can tell you. And I decided to think about that on the way up the Camino Real. And it dawned on me that it was not the constructs that I was using that made sense of my life. It was the projects that I was pursuing. And the personal projects, like personal constructs, give individuals claim on their environment. There was a terrific argument at the time about whether there's no personality at all. It's all situation, it's all contextual. And I wanted to appraise and rectify the fallibilities of that argument by saying that the projects that we're engaged in reflect our traits, and they reflect the contextual affordances and openness that is provided by what I call the sociogenic aspects of our lives.
Dr. Little, I'm going to interrupt you right there because I have to take a quick break, and then we're going to get into those projects and traits and that relationship in your research. So I'll be right back. Well, one of the great parts about working in recovery is seeing former patients successfully move on. And I've had patients that have come up to me years later and shake my hand and say, you know what, sometimes people are kicked out of treatment. And many of these folks move on to become mental health professionals themselves. And of course, the field of psychology is vast. The need for competent practitioners is huge. If you're considering this rewarding career, I urge you to consider the California School of Professional Psychology at Alliant University. Now, I've known them for a long time at Alliant University. I've spoken at their past events. It was founded in 1969. It's boasts an alumni network of nearly 50,000 people worldwide. And Alliant has fostered many of today's mental health pioneers, authors, and advocates. CSPP at Alliant University hosts both on-ground and online programs in business psychology, marriage and family therapy, clinical counseling. They also offer APA-accredited doctoral programs in clinical psychology that can allow for specialization in child psychology, clinical forensic psychology, and integrated psychology. And the faculty is crazy. It's made up of leaders and historical figures like Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers, Viktor Frankl, some of the true fathers of modern psychology. For more information, and I worked alongside of these students as well, by the way, in the clinical setting, as well as having lectured at the institution. So for more on the California School of Professional Psychology, CSPP, at Alliant, click the Alliant banner on our website or visit Alliant, ALLIANT.edu, alliant.edu. Hey, we are back. Of course, we're talking to Dr. Brian Little. He is a scholar and a writer. And where can we find you, Dr. Little? What website would you like people to go to?
BrianRLittle.com.
He recently wrote, Who Are You Really? The Surprising Puzzle of Personality. And you're about to get into your main issue of personal projects and free traits. Go ahead.
Right. I think that oftentimes when we're trying to understand a person, we evaluate them in terms of their where they stand on the Big Five traits. Dan McAdams at Northwestern has made a very astute observation that this serves us well as a psychology of the stranger. Is this person someone whom I can trust? Is it somebody who is likely to be friends with me, that would make us attend to cues of whether the person is agreeable or extroverted or conscientious. Can I rely on him? And the Big Five serve as a useful way of dealing with strangers. But as a psychologist, and as a dad, and as a husband, I want to understand what you are really like.
Right.
Beyond those.
I think you zeroed in at what I don't like about the Big Five.
I can detect that. and I feel that if you look, for example, let's take somebody who you see in the neighborhood, always at parties. For the last 2 months, every barbecue, he's been there. He's there with his wife. Let's call him Robert, or if you wish, Bob, and if you really love him, Bobby. And there he is, yet again. And you may draw the conclusion that Bob is an extrovert, an agreeable extrovert who's always happy to throw a hamburger on and talk to you. What you may be missing is that he may be actually a very introverted and not particularly agreeable person. He might be acting out of character. He may be a pseudo extrovert. And by acting out of character, he, or what I call engaging in free traits, he is both accomplishing something that's positive and he's putting himself into a state of vulnerability. We act out of character for a number of reasons. We do it for professionalism, and we do it out of love. And in his case, it might be out of love because unbeknownst to the Big Five trait theorist who was watching him or the neighbor who doesn't know him, the project that is most consuming him right now is that his wife is in the final stages of the terminal disease. She loves parties. She hasn't got that much time left. And his core project in his life is to be there for Allison.
So I'm going to interrupt you real quick and just take you back to now that we've left the Big Five behind, I hope. How is a project different than a narrative or a motivational state, or both?
Yeah, a project is not meant to be unduly formal. So it can range from taking out the garbage to taking out my political opponent. It can be self-initiated or demanded of you by your social ecology, by your cultural norms and roles. But it in itself constitutes a motivational state. Now,
wait, I want to make sure I get this. Bruce, please interrupt me. But
sure,
so it constitutes a motivational state in the sense that it's not necessarily spontaneously generated from the individual. It's generated within the context of the socio-historical environment, right?
It may be. It may also emerge from what I call the biogenic propensities of an individual. Right. So you can have, which would be more impulsive in a sense, is I got to get out of the house and drive fast because I'm bored. And so it can be biogenically motivated. It can be sociogenically motivated as a kind of life task appropriate to your age.
I have a fever. I got to find some Tylenol. That's purely biogenic. Yeah. All right.
Yeah, exactly. And when you engage in that behavior, then as you approach success, you are in a high intensity motivational state. In fact, I've argued for some time that if we want to look at well-being, it's not the pursuit of happiness that really is the key leitmotif we should be exploring, but the happiness of pursuit. That it is in the pursuits that we engage in that give meaning to us in our lives that we find the essence of what a person is really about.
Which sort of harkens back to old aphorisms, like it's not the destiny, it's the trip or whatever. It's the process.
It does indeed, but it's an admonishment to fellow psychologists to actually pin down what are people doing? What are they pursuing? And it's not just what are they doing, as the behaviorists would have it. It's what you think you're doing, which is back to George Kelly and how we construe what we're doing. Because you may see me as just mowing the lawn. I may be getting away from something pretty oppressive in the kitchen. And so it's a combination of addressing the construals of the person we're trying to understand and the behavior that they are engaging in that allows you to form some inferences, some of which may not be correct.
Okay, so I'm a very concrete person as opposed to Drew, who's more cognitive. So
I can tell that. Yeah.
You take somebody. So in practice, you help people to look at what their traits are. You go through the ocean thing, and then have them explore ways to get out of their usual rut they're in, or a certain way of doing things that may be counterproductive, and create.
He hasn't said that yet. You've filled that all in.
And creating projects that create happiness. Now, are there certain cultures, or I always love epigenetics, but it would seem like if there are cultures that tend to do this, they're going to be happier or unhappy. Or is this something that you find exists already in some places, and you're teaching other people to do it that don't do it?
It's not as prescriptive as you've made it sound. I like very much the notion that you can advise people on choosing projects that might resonate better for them and so on. And to a certain extent, we do that. But I'm more interested in actually the basic science of project pursuit. And there are indeed cultural differences, and cultural differences in what I call free traits. So free traits, if we can get back to that fellow who was acting out of character for his wife, he was engaged in the free trait of extroversion. I have lots of experience with that because I'm neurologically very introverted. Can't take caffeine after 6 in the evening and expect to sleep, for example. So I'm a biogenic introvert. But as a professor, I'm extremely extroverted. The students would never believe until I tell them that I'm very introverted. And it's because I have a core project, which is exciting my students about the field that I adore. And setting off sparks for highly combustible students is the most exciting thing in my life. So at 8 in the morning, I will act as a pseudo-extrovert so they don't fall asleep. But if I were to go on for a fairly long period of time, let's say it's a 3-hour lecture without a break, I would find that it's depleting my resources for coping cognitively. And so I need to take a break. And at the break, whereas a biogenically truly extroverted person would talk to the students, I disappear. And I've been known, and it's even been written up, unfortunately, in other people's books, how I sometimes repair to the men's room with my feet up to avoid being spotted by my students at the break, because I need to lower my neocortical arousal and get myself into a neuropsychological position where I can give a lucid second half to my lecture. So when I talk to people about this, people say, yes. In fact, I'm just beginning to realize that I've been a pseudo-extrovert for 5 years because I just accommodate to my wife's crazy extroversion. And you're right, I do it out of love. My warning, first of all, I think that is a noble aspect of the human condition. To act out of character has two meanings. It's acting differently than you normally do, but it also means acting on the basis of values that matter to you. And I think it's wonderful. I think it can be noble. But you run the risk of burning out if you protractedly engage in free trait behavior. And that's one of the messages that comes through loud and clear when I'm talking to audiences and they say, yes, I have been acting out of character for some time, and I'm starting to feel the autonomic, if they know psychology, the autonomic costs of protractedly acting in ways that go against my biogenic nature. That
intuitively makes sense to me. I can relate to particularly Dr. Little's construct of traits. So let's take it to the average person.
Right.
Let's keep going where Bruce is going.
Analysis.
Yeah. How does the average person? What do they expect to get from analysis? How do they do from a personality analysis? Where should they get it? That kind of thing.
As a personality psychologist, I, of course, don't do therapy myself. I do a lot of advising. Many of my students, in fact, probably the vast majority of them, have gone on into clinical and counseling work. And they have adopted aspects of this into their practice. But at this stage, I don't think we have enough evidence for its clinical use so much as for its use as it has been adopted by some in the positive psychology movement, in coaching, and even people who have read my first book, who've learned a little bit about the details of this.
What's the name of the first? Let's give them the name of the first book.
Oh, it's called Me, Myself, and Us, The Science of Personality and the Art of Well-Being. And people have written to me about that and said that this is starting to really make sense of the way their lives have gone over the last few years, and can I provide some reading and so on. So I wouldn't claim that this may have therapeutic importance, except that it is very congenial with an expanded kind of insight therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, except it takes the prospective creating of projects into the future aspect more seriously. But I don't want to get into premature expostulation for something that hasn't been empirically verified.
And to be fair, there's a lot of, I don't know, confusion, maybe it's not the right word, a lot of discussion about, really what the goals of psychology are. And when we start using words like flourishing, we're sort of talking about optimal health and, enhancement of otherwise healthy people's conduct, as opposed to disease process, disease intervention, mental health, which is these are two different domains. They really are different things.
They are different domains. I mean, interestingly, we found that when we look at how you appraise your projects, there's another 5 factors. We look at how meaningful your projects are, how manageable they are, how connected they are to other people, what positive affect you experience in them, and the negative affect that you experience in them. And these emerge as 5 relatively independent factors. And of course, it's intuitive that to the extent you're engaged in meaningful, manageable, connected projects that have a greater prevalence of positive than negative affect, life is going well, and at best you might be said to be flourishing. Mm-hmm. Part of the time that I'm at Cambridge, I spend as a fellow of the Wellbeing Institute. And that is, as you've mentioned, it is a field that is actually very close back to the humanities and philosophy
I'm sure
on how to live well.
I'm sure of it. Well, because at its core, it's Aristotelian.
It can be Aristotelian. Virtue ethics and that line of reasoning is Aristotelian. I take a somewhat different approach. There's a philosopher I insist my students read, Bernard Williams, who was also at Cambridge, has died now, who talked about ground projects in one's life. And they're very similar to what I call core projects. And he described them as those projects which, if they no longer existed, would impel you to wonder whether it was worth going on at all. And that to me was a very profound way of stating the existential importance, I mean, literally in the existential sense, of core or ground projects in your life. And so if you find that you are no longer funny and you're a comedian, or if you are no longer loved as one who has basked in the love of somebody you trusted for 35 years, the core project that has been abandoned can bring you to those Heideggerian and Sartrean points of questioning deeply whether to go on.
But it would be interesting to correlate it with suicidality or depressions, that kind of thing.
We have looked at it in terms of depression. And interestingly, the one dimension that seems to be most important in both predicting depressogenic tendencies on the one hand, and positive affect on the other, happiness versus despair, is self-efficacy, the extent to which you think your projects are going to be successful. And so to the extent that you are engaged in projects of all the different dimensions we look at, and we have a couple of dozen of them, the extent to which you actually believe this particular project and the sum of them in your life are likely to succeed, that Bandura-like self-efficacy is really, really important.
I'm surprised you didn't say resiliency, because I was expecting that.
We can certainly use that word. Absolutely. Okay. It's a core aspect of resiliency.
But some of these words, resiliency, I hear that, and it's like it's such a psychobabble buzzword.
Yeah.
With reading your stuff, it seems like what happens to people, they get stuck. It's like and some people at a younger, some people at an older age, and it's a way to look at yourself, look at your personality, and looking at ways when you get stuck. Because in life, you get bored at some point, or something like you call it a project fails, and then you just question, what do I do next? Now, if you know yourself, you look at these traits.
Look at your core project.
Yes. And
yes.
Yeah. So it seems like I have to go back to the practical value. I was going, because I'm old. But
you bored?
But no. You
got to reconsider your core project.
I got that old M5, and the lines are going to bust on it. But no, I had this. There was a pathologist I worked with back in medical school, and his core project at 80 years old was to determine why some people, when they hit middle age, flourish and other people don't. He was looking at brain structure, and this is way back before there were functional MRIs. But that's an interesting is there a way to teach people to get excited about life and not just drop off and get bored? And
there's another overlay here we've not brought in, which is interpersonal functioning and intimate relationship, all that kind of stuff, which tends to contribute to all this as well.
It does indeed. And in fact, one of the things that we discovered was that the emotional support of others who love you is crucial to what I call the sustainability of core projects in our lives. Our precept, if you wish, for how to live a flourishing life is to have the sustainable pursuit of core projects. Not necessarily chalk them all up and tick them off as they're done like a bucket list, but the sustainable pursuit of core projects to me is really, really crucial.
Well, speaking of core projects, we need to wrap up our core project here with Dr. Little, which is learning about core projects, strangely enough. But we appreciate you participating with us again. Give us the website.
BrianRLittle.com.
All right.
And you're in England, right? Where are you, at Cambridge?
At Cambridge University.
Good. Well, I'm going to be in England. I'll come visit you in September.
Oh.
Hey, let's do it. I'll be there.
Do you live in Cambridge?
I spend half the time in Cambridge and half the time in Canada, where I am now. My wife is a professor in Ottawa. So
you got to make sure you send them an email and let them know when you're going to
September. Are you going to be there in September?
Absolutely. That would be great fun.
Cambridge is a beautiful town.
Yeah.
Isn't it? Yeah. Go punting.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, it's your guest.
Dr. Little?
Hi, Dr. Little. This is Michelle. I'm a lady of many personal projects.
You are sort of...
I am the poster child of personal
You're
projects.
embodied projects.
Multi-personality disorder.
Yes. So here's a question I have. As a young, impressionable gal of 17 or so, I started reading Ayn Rand, and Atlas Shrugged became one of my favorite books of my whole life. I need to go back and read it now as an old lady and see if it would have the same impact. But sort of what I took away from that is, this whole idea of everything kind of being self-serving and this virtue of selfishness. And it seems to me that there's some correlation here, that these personal projects, which are self-fulfilling, because even if Bob is trying to help his wife Allison in the last months of her death, really he's soothing himself primarily, right? So these personal projects are sort of a way of a self-fulfilling thing more than anything else. Even if you're fulfilling someone else, the fulfillment you're getting is your own fulfillment, because you are fulfilling someone else's needs or requests. Or
I think this is a common way of looking at altruism and so on. I don't buy
is there altruism though? That's the question. The whole question is
I don't buy that critique. I think Rand has been taken by some to emphasize what we call the agentic aspect of lives, where you shape your life for yourself and by yourself. And I think we reflect that by looking at personal projects, for sure. But if there's anything that's come out of our analyses over the years, it's that these cannot be done. These cannot be successfully accomplished. They cannot be sustained without the assistance, the help, the empathy, the nurturance of other people. And we even found that with entrepreneurs, and we found it with looking at the personal project of being pregnant. That with mothers, we looked at APGAR scores of the child at delivery and subjective ratings of how happy they were with the birth. And the best predictor of those outcome measures was the emotional support of your partner. And then when we looked at entrepreneurs, we found that the best predictor of financial success in the first year was the emotional support of your partner. And so, when entrepreneurs talk about this project is my baby, it may be more than just a metaphorical link.
But it still all sort of siphons back to that person's own needs being fulfilled, right? I mean, your own ego is being stroked by your partner and your own...
I don't think so.
No.
I think you and I disagree on that one. I think when you have that unconditional, delighted, absorbed, magical connection with your kid at 3 months of age, I don't think you're satisfying a basic need. I think that you're igniting a connection that transcends selfish.
Well, I don't think that it can't be beneficial to both partners or both people that are involved in the interaction. Of course I do. I mean, I'm a mother. I have children. My whole life has been devoted to
That's
children.
the way I'm pushing back.
But I'm just saying, still, at the end of the day, if I were to say, if my kid needed a heart transplant, and I would say I would give my heart to my child and thereby take my own life, it would still, I mean, it sounds so selfish to say, but it would still be better for me to know that my kid was living than...
Yeah, it's very hard to counter that argument. I agree. You can always push it, saying even the person who is suffering deeply and profoundly is happy to know that he has suffered as a saint. And it's hard to counter that. It's just that it doesn't square with me.
Well, I guess it doesn't sound very nice.
Well, you see, you're talking to a highly agreeable introvert. And as somebody who likes to see the redeeming, and delightful aspects of human nature, I guess it's a little more difficult for me to say, yeah, you're just being selfish, really. But it's a fascinating philosophical discussion, isn't it?
Thank you, Dr. Little. Again, remind everyone we had that very successful Facebook Live that one date. Was that last week? Whatever went up last week. And we will have it again, so keep an eye on our Facebook and also our Twitter handle at Weekly Infusion. Anywhere else they should look for at drdrew.com, of course. We'll have announcements on when the future Facebook Lives will come up, and our Facebook page.
Your Twitter.
And also my Twitter, Dr. Drew.
Yes.
Twitter, follow me there. And again, we like doing that. We get calls. You guys like it. We get to go on YouTube/Dr. Drew. We get to go on the Facebook Live. And it's a new, interesting, multi-dimensional sort of way of doing podcasting. So we dig that. Let's go to a couple of questions here. People emailed us. Again, you can go to drdrew.com/contact to send emails. And Nicole opens with "You Live," which thank you, Nicole. Mike, as we said, Mike Catherwood's in there. We're mixing up with him on the This Life podcast. Are there any side effects to eating hair? I can find
Hairball.
Well, it's Bezor. It's called a Bezor. She has trichotillomania. I've always been worried about the consequence, but I can't stop the urge. If you go to Nicole Angemi's Instagram, she puts up Bezors once in a while. Nicole, what's that? We
have an article about it on Dr. Drew.
Oh, we did trichotillomania. That's right. We said the possible complication is a Bezor. And she said she can't stop the urge and do it unknowingly sometimes. I'm embarrassed to ask my doctor.
OCD.
Yeah, Nicole, trichotillomania is difficult to treat. Most people kind of live with it. There are adversive kinds of things you can get. You can be in a high dose of SSRIs. There are behavioral interventions out there, but if it's sort of an intermittent thing for you, look, you have to eat a lot of hair to get a Bezoar. And finally, one more email. This is from Alex. Okay, this is getting a little more complicated. I've been listening, paying close attention. She liked liked the Wes Chapman horrifyingly brilliant segments. The most recent episode with Dr. Janina Scarlett. This was at the Dr. Drew podcast. Particularly the superhero narrative and the use of the superhero narrative for therapy. You need to go listen to that podcast if you want to know what that's all about. I am curious because I can heavily relate to the attachment to a fictional character kind of thing. However, I'm perplexed about the specific character I've latched onto. Since I was 8 years or so, I've been super into the Phantom of the Opera. The original novel, any movies, the character of the Phantom just resonated with me in a huge way. I wanted to be like him, and still do in a lot of ways. This must be a male. After listening to your segment, I wondered if it had to do with trauma/upbringing possibility. Yeah, well, when you connect to very specific kinds of images, sometimes it's a result of trauma in and around that time, and this is an attempt to kind of make meaning and soothe. Sometimes it's a traumatic reenactment, like some way this reminds you of something about that trauma, and so you're revisiting it over and over again. And sometimes it's just,
vampirism.
Well, it's not. Would you think it's that? I mean,
I'm just saying that taken to the extreme. I think we're seeing that in culture today,
right? And that's highly culturally reinforced by groups and stuff. But I would sometimes it's just as they said, Dr. Freud would say, a cigar is sometimes just a good smoke.
Right.
Sometimes it was the right image at the right time.
But it can be if you have an attachment trauma, then you can reattach to something.
Right.
As a superhero. That could be positive or negative.
Well, this isn't a superhero, though.
No,
this is
Phantom of the Opera.
Yes, Phantom of the Opera, which is a sort of a evil doer, right? It's not really a superhero. But the superhero thing was that Janina Scarlett interview I did was really trying to get people to find ways to get out of misery and try to find ways to mobilize and motivate and change. Wes Chapman is a guy that was horribly, ritualistically abused, was in and out of psychiatric hospitals, multiple suicide attempts. Again, I did several podcasts with him at the Dr. Drew podcast. Suicide attempt at the age of 10, locked units, and all of a sudden one day he went, this isn't me. I got to get better. And he did. And now he's an amazing person.
Was it the fireman guy that we...
No, you never talked to him. He may come... I can get him in here one of these days. And
what was his
he talks... Well, a lot of therapies and stuff like that, but he talks about awakening the hero, that somehow he mobilized something in him that was his own personal hero. And Janina Scarlett does something called superhero therapy, which is very similar to that. She herself a trauma survivor, sort of attached to this kind of idea. And to me, really just the idea of we could use some heroes today, and people need to sort of be motivated out of the trauma and the reenactments and the misery, and maybe the hero archetype.
What's the Joseph Campbell thing?
Yeah, I was thinking Joseph Campbell or Jung, or these people that sort of had archetypes out there. Right. Maybe this is time for that archetype to be sort of resurrected, mobilized in some way in ourselves or in one another, that we use it in one another to help. So that's what that was all about. Phantom of the Opera, again, probably just a good smoke.
A little dark.
Probably just good smoke. Yeah. And again, a self-soothing thing as much as anything. But thank you, Dr. Little. Thank you, Bruce. I will see you next week. We'll see you all next time.
Remember, you can find all these podcasts at drdrew.com. The Dr. Drew podcast, the This Life podcast with Dr. Drew and Bob Forrest, and the Adam and Drew podcast, which is available 5 days a week. Find them all on iTunes and rate us 5 stars. Subscribe and get it first. And if you're really happy, click on the Amazon banner at drdrew.com to help support the show. We'll thank you for it. If you join the email list via drdrew.com/contact, we'll send you a weekly Infusion newsletter with Dr. Drew's news. We're so grateful when you get in touch. We read all your emails and we'll bring you the subject matter you want to hear about.